And today we have with us a legend. I'm joined by someone I know needs no introduction to any of you in this audience. Anytime I discuss the situation in Ukraine, I'm always name dropping him because he's provided simply the best, most consistent, and holistic analysis of the Ukrainian conflict from day one. You've, of course, seen him as a regular guest back on the old Tucker Carlson days, and he's now, like Tucker, on Twitter. Colonel Douglas McGregor. Sir, it is an honor and a privilege to have you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's wonderful to have you. So just yesterday, The Telegraph published this headline here: Ukraine and the West are facing a devastating defeat. And I'm almost wondering if it's more of an admission than a headline. The piece argues that a failed Ukrainian counteroffensive, the inability of Ukrainian troops to stop Russian territorial gains, and the seeming impotence of NATO is just ultimately leading to an emboldened and stronger Russia, and by implication as well, China. Now, you've been arguing this for a year and a half. So first, big picture, what's your assessment of where we are right now on the battlefield? And secondly, why, in your opinion, has it taken the legacy media, or at least a semblance of them, so long to come to terms with what's really happening here?
Well, let's answer the second question first. We need to give credit to the Telegraph because of the British papers is probably the one that is closer to the truth than most. In most cases, the British newspapers just print utter nonsense.
They're the worst.
They take the narrative of the inevitable Ukrainian victory. Russians are losing. Russians are incompetent. Russians are stupid, and so forth. And they repurpose that over and over and over and over and over again in the hopes that you're finally going to believe it. But the Telegraph is a little bit better. Now, what they've done is, in fact, an admission. You're right. This is not news. This has been true for a long time. And I wouldn't expect anything to change dramatically in the rest of the West right now, for the simple reason that the same people driving this war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine also are people that are largely dominating the finance markets, dominating media, and ultimately shaping policy for our governments. I talk all the time about government by donors. That's what we've got in the United States. I mean, I can't imagine any American signing on for some sort of open-ended war in Eastern Ukraine if he or she were asked, what do you think? And first question is, where is it? And secondly, why are we involved? So this is entirely a function of people with lots of money. Now, as far as where are we now? Well, remember that when this began back in February and March of last year, the Russians entered Ukraine with a very small force. Only about 90,000 troops went in. Another 100,000 were placed around the border. And to my surprise, and ultimately to the surprise of many, it was a very careful, cautious, slow approach because we did not know at the time. But President Putin had said, look, I don't want to kill large numbers of Ukrainians. I mean, after all, these are people just like us.
Right.
We're not interested in that. That's not why we're here. We're here because we cannot allow Ukraine to become a platform for attack against us, simply. And we want to put an end to the outrages committed against Russians. Russians were not second-class citizens in Ukraine. They were third-class citizens.
Right.
And he wanted to put an end to this. This, of course, was the background to the Minsk Accords, which, as we now know in retrospect, were entirely fiction. There was never any intention on the part of the West to make any of it real, sadly. This didn't work out very well, as we all know. They moved slowly. They were very careful. They avoided any collateral damage. And they thought they would find a negotiating partner. There was none in sight. We made it very clear, even at the end of March, beginning of April, when the rumor sort of slipped out that the team from Ukraine said, well, we can accept neutrality. Suddenly, Boris Johnson arrived on the scene with a message from Biden saying, absolutely not.
Right.
You will not be neutral. You will fight on. And by the way, we'll give you everything you need. And these are important promises. And I think Zelensky and his friends stood around and said, well, if the United States and all of its allies are going to back us to the hilt and give us anything we need, well, I guess we'll just fight on to the bitter end.
Yeah.
The problem with that, as you know, Steve, this is the America of 2023. It is not the America of 1991.
Right.
We do not possess the kind of military power, overwhelming military power that we had in 1991. We largely dismantled it. We have a force that is sort of a boutique force now, designed to deal with small countries in Asia and Africa, maybe even Latin America, that don't have much with which they can protect themselves, that we can bully, to be frank.
Right.
And so that's what we've done. So all of a sudden now we're trying to ship things to Ukraine, and we grossly misread the Russians.
Right.
Ukraine for us was viewed as, well, this is an opportunity for us to harm Russia. Maybe we can destroy the regime, gain access to all of Russia's resources. This would make BlackRock, Monsanto, Cargill, all the usual suspects very happy because they could cash in on all of this. It didn't work. Yeah. Russia said, no, for us, for Ukraine is an existential question. So the Russians decided we were wrong. We've got to sort of punt at this point and build up our force for a much longer and more serious conflict than we had anticipated. So now you have 750,000 Russian troops in and around Ukraine.
Wow.
They're not going to allow Ukraine to ever join NATO. They made that very clear. And they've said that they're going to, quote unquote, denazify Ukraine. Well, Nazi is probably a strong word, but the point is Ukrainians have been busy. Ukrainians in the Azov regiment and their associates have committed terrible atrocities against the Russians, all of which naturally in the Western media are blamed on the Russians.
Right.
These are the things the Ukrainians have done. So I think the situation is as follows. The Ukrainians have lost between 300, 350,000 dead. These are dead Ukrainian soldiers. I don't know how many civilians have been killed. I'm sure large numbers. How many wounded? Probably at least that many. The hospitals are full, and these people will never return to active duty in most cases. Millions of people have left Ukraine. We estimate 12 to 14 million left. At least 2 million went east. They were probably Russians to begin with. The others have gone west, and every Ukrainian who's interviewed coming into Poland or Germany or any of these countries immediately says, I will never go back.
Right.
So we've succeeded now in not only killing large numbers of Ukrainians in this pointless war that really never had to happen. We didn't have to drag Ukraine into NATO. We didn't have to put U.S. and allied forces into Ukraine. We don't need to plant missiles on Russia's borders. None of those things have to happen. Could have been neutral. And the Ukrainian nation itself is at risk of going under, literally. Right. Now, what happens next? Well, I think we know what happens next. This whole counteroffensive, which was much celebrated, went nowhere.
Nowhere.
26,000 more Ukrainian soldiers at least have been killed as a result of this. I don't know the totals of wounded. Over 1,000 armored fighting vehicles, artillery systems, and so forth. We say we're going to replenish this. The real question is, what has Ukraine got left? And I'm told by most of the people that I trust, my sources, both here and of course in Europe, probably 10 brigades or somewhere between 35 and 40,000 trained and equipped troops. That's about it.
Wow.
In the meantime, the Russians have now launched an offensive on the Liman-Sloviansk axis, which is up in the northeast corner. It's headed, I think, to the north and to the west. I think we'll see them eventually move towards Kharkov, probably encircle the city. And if I know the Russians will then invite the Ukrainians to attack them. And they will obliterate them the same way they've obliterated everyone down in southern Ukraine. And what do the Russians want a negotiation partner? I think they do. I think they would like to negotiate. But there are certain things that they've got to have. One is Ukraine's got to be neutral.
Right.
They're not going to allow a NATO state on its border that will become a platform for attack. Right. Secondly, they want all the aid to stop. In other words, we've got to suspend all this military aid to Ukraine to ensure that it remains hostile. And then finally, we've got to get all of our people out. Americans, other Europeans in NATO, in uniform, out of uniform, they've all got to leave. Nobody wants to do that, because if we do that, Steve, we will admit we were wrong.
Right. We'll admit the defeat. Exactly. Right. And we can't do that. That emboldens Russia and China, and it's impossible. We can't. Is this where the cluster munitions come in with and the other recent aid packages? I recall you saying something. This is really kind of like, this is a sign of desperation in many respects.
Well, listen, I think everything that we're dealing with now is desperation and disintegration. It falls into one of those categories. Desperation because the Ukrainian position is really unrecoverable, and disintegration because that's what's happening inside Ukraine. There was a report that was provided by senior officers in the Kievan police department in eastern Ukraine. Not eastern Ukraine, but the capital of Ukraine. This report was leaked, I think, because people wanted to know the truth inside the Ukrainian armed forces, and it paints a terrible picture. It talks about desertions are way up. Units, platoons, companies are calling the Russians and telling them they can't evacuate their wounded. The Ukrainian chain of command won't evacuate them. They don't have the means and the wherewithal. And so Ukrainian commanders say, I don't want my soldiers to die.
Right.
Can we surrender? And the Russians, from the very beginning, have always treated the Ukrainian soldiers very well. Very, very smart move. And when your Russian forces come in and the area falls under their control, immediately large numbers, convoys arrive with food and medicine and support. I mean, this is not the Soviet Union. This is much closer to Tsarist Russia, only vastly improved, I would argue.
Right.
And if you look at the way things have been handled, I would say that Putin has been remarkably restrained.
Right.
Almost anybody else over there would have been infuriated by the way in which we treated Russians. We've treated them with contempt. We've ignored any of their proposals. This can't go on. And the longer it goes on, the more damage to Ukraine. And as I've said before, if we persist in this, there will be hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on Poland's border. Which, of course, is the exact opposite of what we were trying to achieve.
Right, exactly.
I mean, it's just utterly stupid. Back in 1998, 99, when Ukraine came up for discussion, said, well, where does Ukraine fit into all of this? We said, well, it already performs a very valuable service. They said, what's that? It sits between us and Russia and keeps the Russian forces 500 miles east of NATO.
Wow.
And everybody walked away. End of discussion. When Eisenhower was president in the 1950s, Austria adopted neutrality. And Eisenhower's comment was, see if we can't get other states in the region to adopt neutrality, because we don't have the wherewithal to defend them all.
Right.
This is Eisenhower in the 50s as president. He wasn't a fool. He said, how can we reinforce all these troops in Eastern Europe very rapidly? How do we get across the Atlantic? The Russians will have submarines out there. They'll have aircraft out there. Forget it. We can't do it. So let's see if we can get more people to adopt neutrality. And here we are fighting it.
Right.
And the question is, why? And I think we know the answer. It started with this for all the wrong reasons. Greed, and also to extend this wokeism.
Yeah.
And look, they've succeeded. Really, the left has had enormous success in Europe. Europe is in shambles. Look at France. Look at Germany. Look at Italy. Look at Britain. They flooded these societies, European societies, with millions and millions of non-Europeans.
Yeah.
And everyone said, well, we'll find a way to assimilate these people. These people didn't come to be assimilated. They came to assimilate the Europeans.
Right.
We're in a very similar position here. People aren't paying attention to it. Right. If you don't pay attention to immigration, then that means that you don't pay attention to your country, to your society, the health of it, its needs. You know, somebody said, well, it's racist if you do that. No, let's let every Mexican, Peruvian, Colombian, I don't care what they are, African who has a degree in basic mathematics and speaks English into the country.
Right.
We can use that.
Right.
Which is
what we've historically done. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So it's all nonsense, but we've fallen victim to this. And I think Putin sat there and said, you're not going to do to me what you've done to Europe. Right. I think the European electorates are going to wake up. They're going to figure out they're the victims of all of this. They're in trouble. You know, a French general was on the phone with me the other day, and he told me something that I was unaware of. He said, you realize, Douglas, that if you add the numbers of operational functioning tanks in Great Britain, France, and Germany up, you get 600 tanks.
Wow.
Well, this is a joke. It's a joke. What have we got? I mean, this is the other thing. The Russians right now in this new Axis reportedly have 900 tanks.
Wow.
Hundreds of artillery systems and so forth. Of course,
Right.
for them, it's a serious war that threatens them. They want to win it and end it.
Right.
We're not treating it that way.
Right.
And we've got to start thinking about this because, Steve, we can't sit in splendid isolation and expect that we will not suffer.
Right.
Our borders are open. The whole southern tier is a danger to us. We don't know who's coming in. And the criminality is unbelievable.
Right.
And criminals are ready to work with almost anybody.
Right.
You walk in with enough cash, and we're already seeing arms and equipment that we ship to Ukraine, Javelin missiles, things like that, show up in the hands of Mexican cartels.
Wow.
This is insane. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that, the East-West dichotomy now is actually more a North-South dichotomy, a global North, global South dichotomy, and the South is, bubbling up into the North here. And I couldn't agree with you more. That's what, again, I loved, we all loved Tucker, and just his merciless way that he would push our politicians, say, why are we more concerned about Ukraine's borders than our own? Explain this to me. He was doing it to Tim Scott the other day. I don't know anyone who's been killed by a Russian, but I know plenty of people who have actually been killed by Mexicans with the fentanyl, addictions.
Well, I'm always astonished at people that want to argue that China is this existential threat.
Right.
And I said, well, if it's an existential threat, why aren't you closing the border?
Right.
How many thousands of Chinese have poured into our country just this year? And we're not talking about families. Most of them are just young men. And a friend of mine who works over in Shanghai and Hong Kong, frequently in the banking industry, said, well, most of these people are from the shadow banking industry that Xi has shut down. They were labeled criminals inside China. So they're coming over here to open businesses. I'm sure some of that's true. But again, if you're serious about your intellectual property, if you're serious about the security of your country, instead of making war overseas, control the border. Go after the criminals inside our country.
Right.
Shut it down.
Right.
And now you look at The Sound of Freedom, which is a brilliant film.
Yep.
And what does it tell you? It tells you everything we've said here in spades.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Hollywood hates it.
Yeah.
New York City hates it. Washington hates it. Why? Makes no sense. What are we celebrating pedophilia now?
Yeah. It's absurd.
It's insane.
It's so interesting. I mean, talk about, divine intervention here. Had that actually come out 5 years ago after they finished it, Colonel, I don't think we would have, I think it would have flopped. I just don't think we were prepared for it. Trump was in the White House. I think we got very lackadaisical, and it took the border to start going insane. It took a lot of these things that we all knew was going under the surface to boil up. Epstein came in, all of that sort of stuff. And so it amazingly, 5 years, a perfect time. Boom. Now I think it's about to hit 100 million today. I think it's literally just hours away from hitting 100 million at the box office. I heard it referred to as a box office coup, which I thought was a lovely way of putting it.
Hollywood prefers to sell sin.
Yeah, there you go.
Selling sin is easy because people are always inclined to let down their guard. The old expression, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Actually, I think it's the other way around. I think flesh is too strong.
Yeah, there you go.
Not strong enough.
There you
go. Having said all of that, we can't go on like this.
Yeah.
And the Ukraine war has to be seen as another manifestation of everything that's wrong here and in the West at large.
Right.
And we need to see it that way and get out of it and stop it. There's no reason for us to have a war with the Russians. None. Especially with the growing traditionalism here in the heartland of America that overlaps perfectly with the rising neo-traditionalism in Russia. And even in China, I've heard you said China's far more Confucian than communist at this point. It's all part of this post
secular retraditionalization. I forget who said it, but someone made the observation. It was a nice quip. Russia was isolated by the West, and the West is now being isolated by the rest. So 80-90% of the world's population, they're not participating in the sanctions, and they're quietly rooting for Russia, not because of even the Russia-Ukraine situation per se, but just as pushback against what they see to be American hegemony and just a serious bully. And I think
you just hit on a very important point, Steve, that I don't think enough Americans are aware. If you look at Russia, China, and India, just those three countries, that's a better part of humanity.
Right.
Those three countries are now being joined by more than 45 other countries in the attempt to develop a new financial system, a new basket of currencies or currency itself that's pegged to gold. Now, why would they bother to do this? Remember, our financial geniuses in the Fed have been telling us for years, gold doesn't matter. Well, then why do banks keep gold around? Well, it's a tradition. Really? I would love to start a tradition like that and keep, tons of gold.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that they have had it with our financial dominance because we've used the World Bank and the other institutions at our disposal that we dominate to bully people, to make them do things that they otherwise would not do. All the sort of proverbial chickens are coming back to roost, as you say.
Right.
But Americans have got to wake up, and they've got to understand that what we're trying to achieve in this country is we want to resurrect America. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where America is in ruins. Somebody said to me, America is a patient on life support. Maybe. I don't know. I've got lots of friends. I'll tell you what, the people that are most acutely sensitive to this are people who've immigrated to the country from Europe or Northeast Asia, sometimes from the Middle East, because the legal immigrants come here with a different set of expectations, a different set of goals and desires. By the way, they really want to be Americans.
Right, exactly.
And they see a population here that's lost its sense of identity or allowed a government to rob it of its identity.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's the death of America. And I think that's what the left is about. I think the left wants America to look like California. Right. So what do you do? Well, you have to make the society look like California. You have to make the armed forces look like California. That's happening. When I came into the Army years ago, this is back in the 70s, late 70s, non-commissioned officers would look at you while you were standing out there in formation. They'd walk up to somebody who didn't look quite right, and they'd say, "Son, are you strange or are you from California?" And everybody would chuckle under their breath, Well, there was some truth in that question. Right. And now you look at the ranks and you look at the people they want to bring in, and then you look at the people they want to get rid of, and it looks an awful lot like they want to make it the Californian, the California fornication or something?
Yeah, Californication. That's right, yeah.
And that'll mean we have no military at all. It'll be destroyed.
Right.
The whole idea of a meritocracy, which we think we had, it was never perfect. Nothing is ever perfect.
No.
But now we have walked away from it completely.
Right.
We want to advance people for every conceivable reason, but demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. Those are the things that should count. And apparently for the left, they don't count.
They don't count. Yeah, I've heard it actually referred to as refeudalization. It's sort of a new kind of caste system where you have bankers and billionaires amassing so much power in the hands of very, very few. At the same time, instead of having a clerical class sort of, imposing a religious fundamentalism, as it were, on people, you have a clerisy class of these university profs and Hollywood celebrities and so forth, imposing this radical ideology that's every bit as prone to excommunication, right? I.e., cancel culture as anything else, right? Just ask Tucker, for heaven's sakes, with that. So, do you have any hope for an off ramp here, Colonel? I mean, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, as you noticed, it's now widely admitted as total failure. Are there any cool heads left in the swamp or in Brussels or in London that want to dial this escalating insanity back?
Well, I wouldn't look for any rationality or reason right now from the swamp in Washington, New York City, or London. Remember, New York City and London are the two big banking centers.
Right.
Their interests are bound up with this war and destroying Russia for the reasons we've already covered. But inside Washington, no, it's donor driven.
Yeah.
All the donors want the war. If the donors changed their minds tomorrow morning and say no more war, then Washington would walk in a different direction.
Right.
But there is hope in Europe. And even though Europe is beset with its own set of problems, I think there is a growing realization that they've walked into a giant bear trap and they want to get out.
Right.
At the Vilnius conference, behind the scenes, Scholz tried to tell Biden, we Germans don't want to destroy Russia. That's not what we signed up for. We don't want that. I think Scholz knows, I think Macron knows, and certainly Sunak knows they're not long for the political world they're operating in.
Right.
They're not going to be around long.
Right.
Now, what comes next, I think, will be a series of governments. There'll be confusion. But one thing people will agree to, we don't want to be part of this war against Russia.
Right.
I always joke because I run into so many of my Norwegian friends that are so anxious to fight. I say, well, where are all those Norwegian formations outfitted and ready to commit to the Eastern Front? It's a joke. Nobody wants to go there and fight. No. It's all being done on the backs of Ukrainians.
Right.
Nobody seems to care that their cemeteries are filling up. No one seems to care we're destroying their families.
Right.
Doesn't make any sense. So I think the Europeans are our best hope. Right. That they will eventually change governments. People will walk in and say enough's enough.
Right.
And then what happens here? I don't know, Steve. What do you think? What do you think will happen here?
Yeah, well, the uprising seems to be really happening around the country. We just got a Gallup poll that just came out that conservatives are now outnumbering liberals almost 2-1, and it's been a massive upswing in the last 10 years, which is very interesting because it kind of corresponds with the efforts at wokeness and imposing wokeness. The more even the left seems to have had it, like Bill Maher and so forth, with woke things. But I guess for me, the concern really is just, when all said and done, the integrity of our elections. I mean, so many of us feel like, we can have all the numbers in the world, but, if there's some shenanigans going on in certain states like, Arizona or Georgia or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, we just feel like just easily thwarted through the standard American ballot process. And then, as Vivek Ramaswamy said, and then, when that's thwarted like that, then you do get these J6, kind of explosions and so forth. So that's what makes me nervous. But I think we've got the numbers. It's just trying to, we're as you said, we're against the billionaires and the bureaucrats and the CEOs and the legacy media all teaming up. And it's a very formidable opponent, but as Victor Davis Hanson would say, but they don't have the people. The people refuse to bend the knee, and that's really what